Welcome back to another virtual tasting with Binny's. I'm Pat from the Whiskey Hotline, joined by Brett. We got a few guests with us today. Jake Parrot from House Alpens, noted importer of fine wines and spirits, and also our buddy Dan Farber, who is a winemaker and distiller. You can see him in front of his still currently. And Alicia, who does the wine education at Binny's, is here with us as well. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite categories in the store today, and that is vermouth. And we are hoping that this kind of turns into a bit of a series like we did with agave spirits and mezcal, where we kind of expound on this subject every week, week by week, until we kind of cover it all, I guess. But we want to bring Jake in because the vermouth that are imported by House Alpens are arguably some of the best in the world. And so Jake is really good at kind of connecting the dots between these nerdy things and details that Brett and I would tend to focus on, and what people like you actually use these vermouths for at home or in a restaurant. So Jake, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Dan, thank you for joining us. Vermouth 101, I guess, where do you want to start, Jake? You brought some slides to kind of go through, and I think it covers most of our basics here.
Yeah, I apologize for the slide deck. It just sort of seemed like the right way to do it because I wanted to set up a little bit of structure. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time.
I forgot about questions. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A. Sorry, Jake.
Yes, use the Q&A rather than the chat. It's much easier to deal with at the end. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a little chat about the history and use of vermouth, and through the eyes of us as a company. And we import traditional vermouths. You know, we're not going to be the ones who are going to be, talking about exotic vermouths from all over the world. There's certainly a lot of that going on, but I want to give you the real kind of grounding in the basics of where this stuff came from. So what is vermouth? At its very core, vermouth is wine bittered with wormwood, and both of those things are really important. You cannot call a product of vermouth in the European Union if it isn't wine, and you cannot call a product vermouth in the European Union if it isn't bittered with wormwood. Those of you who are looking for hallucinations are going to be sadly disappointed. The amount of wormwood in a vermouth to make it useful for drinking and mixing is not going to be so much that it's going to provide you with any of those Van Gogh tendencies, if you will. But it does have.
If you process wormwood anyway, right? There is a way that you process the thujone out of wormwood once you start using it in alcoholic beverages anyway, right? It doesn't carry across.
Yeah, pretty much. It remains to be seen whether thujone is actually the psychoactive ingredient, but
Okay. And then does the United States is not required to follow the EU?
Right. In our view, American laws do not respect the category. Yes.
Okay.
Fair.
This is a European category with European origins. They've only been doing it for 2,500 years, and here we come along and think that we know something about it. So, but wine bittered with wormwood. Wormwood is intensely herbaceous and bitter. You taste it. To the extent that you taste it, you're going to taste it on the tip of your tongue. If you sense a real earthiness as well on the back of your tongue, chances are that's probably more wormwood in a vermouth than you'd really want for mixing the sort of classic cocktails that vermouth became so important for. But wine bittered with wormwood, that's vermouth. So what does that mean? Put it in the fridge. This is wine.
Yep.
Aromatized wine is wine.
So when I go back to my parents' place and they have vermouth that I've seen for 4 years in a row in the same position on the bar.
It was bad 3 years, 11 months, and 3 weeks ago.
Cook with it.
No. I would never disrespect my pan with that stuff. Look,
the tradition of wormwood and wine goes back, way before
thousands of years,
right?
Yeah, just wait a couple slides.
Oh.
The fact is this, a bottle of vermouth is a bottle of wine, but because its flavor doesn't depend as much on the grapes as just a regular bottle of wine, because they generally have sugar in them, which makes the liquid thicker and harder for high aromatics to evaporate, etc. A bottle of vermouth does last longer than a bottle of wine once you open it, but keep it in the fridge, follow your nose. For drier vermouths, you want to use within a couple, 3 weeks, and for sweeter vermouths, maybe a week or two longer than that. But luckily, we sell a lot of our vermouths in half bottles, which is very, very handy for ticking it over. Or if you want to give someone a Manhattan kit as a gift, buy them a full bottle of great whiskey from Binny's and a half bottle of red vermouth. So there you go. So that's
get them a full bottle of vermouth and a bottle of club soda.
Well, that's true. More on that in a moment. So what we're going to talk about today when we get into the products is both how you would mix with them, because that is the modern history of vermouth, but also the kinds of foods you can enjoy with each of these vermouths. So you might guess what the trope is. So wine and wormwood, as Dan was saying, goes back thousands of years. Like most things, the Chinese invented it.
Yeah, like 2000 BC, 2500 BC, thousands of years.
Yeah. In terms of an early modern history of vermouth, though, if you think about, wormwood grows all over Europe. I mean, it's certainly best known in mountain areas, but it grows in a lot of places. And if you're ancient Greece, you've got wine, you've got honey, that was a big deal. You've got citrus, and you've got wormwood. Well, heck, you can make a pretty decent vermouth out of that. And you go from there, and just like everything else, the Romans stole the idea. And in the height of Roman society, vermouth was almost like a hipster thing. Every house had their own recipe. They didn't use the word vermouth. That word comes from the Germans in the 1500s, because vermouth comes from the word Vermouth, the word for wormwood, and more on that in a moment.
So vermouth circle and it's vermouth and hipster culture has come full circle now.
Yeah, I mean it's
Gotcha.
It's 2,200 years of hipsterdom here.
I am wearing my tightest pants tonight while I taste this vermouth. So
no comment.
So here in wormwood and maybe in Dan is how prevalent is wormwood as a common plant grown in the United States or North America?
It's become more common, but it was, I would say, relatively uncommon. Some of the other key ingredients in European vermouth are actually much more common, natively common in the United States, such as yarrow, for instance. But we're still on wormwood.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a little bit more on this in a moment, but these things were local expressions. They were just local expressions built around wormwood. It's a well-told tale that the first company to commercialize vermouth is Carpano, 1786, I believe, is what they claim. That seems reasonable enough to me. But much like a lot of other things in the drinks trade, the business really explodes after the building of railroads and the concentration of wealth in cities, etc., when vermouth became a societal thing for a couple of different reasons. But first, let's talk about where it comes from. The two classical locations that we think about for vermouth are just on the opposite sides of the Mont Blanc tunnel from each other. In France, in Chambéry. Chambéry is where you get off the big train from Paris to go skiing. And then in Italy, Torino was the classic shipping point for vermouth from the Piedmont region of Italy all over the world. But the production itself was generally centered between Torino and the commune of Asti in Piedmont. So known for Moscato, amongst other things.
But those were the two traditional capitals of Savoy, right? From Chambéry to Torino. So it's really Savoyard
right. The key point here is when these two centers built up as vermouth producing centers, the modern idea of France and the modern idea of Italy did not exist. These two cities were part of the same political unit, the so-called Kingdom of Sardinia. And within that, the House of Savoy, the Duchy of Savoy. So it was natural for knowledge to flow between the two, but there was also a bifurcation of styles based around local tastes. So why did this stuff exist, and why, how was it made? That wormwood, if you go back at that time, and again, we're getting into the commercialization of vermouth, you bought wine kind of like you buy cheese today at a nice cheese shop, essentially based on what the appellation is. And so, but wormwood, as well as gentian and quinine, two other bitter botanicals that we'll talk about hopefully on another night, were sought after for their own reasons. Now, we can't talk about that. It is illegal for me to talk about why people wanted to ingest wormwood. It is illegal for Brett to talk about it. It is illegal for Pat to talk about it. It's illegal.
Never stopped
to
us.
talk about it. It's even illegal for Dan to talk about it. But you can Google it. It ain't that hard. So the idea of
we can't talk about it.
No, because it'd be making health claims about alcohol.
Ah.
But the idea is that if you are a producer, if you were an herbalist or a wine producer, you could get your name out there by getting this bottle of vermouth because everybody wanted the wormwood. And then if people liked it, they'd look into everything else that was in it and why it was, who it was made by, etc. This isn't really all that different from the way we think about things today. You know,
well, that's a variant of a whole huge family of both wine-based and distilled spirits in Europe at that time.
Sure,
as medicines.
Sure. Well, you said the M word. Before 1919, virtually all of them were wine-based, except for the ones that were made in big cities, because that's what you had. And there's point two.
Right.
Wine was less expensive. It was available in the countryside, and it was, way more available than distilled alcohol. It takes a big war to make distilled alcohol cheap. So you had people wanted the wormwood. You had wine, so you found a way to put them together, and then you wanted to make it an expression of who you were and where you were. So Chambéry vermouths, an area where that was very much known for its mountain herbs and very much known for light and fragrant white wines, the vermouths were gentler. Torino, Piemonte, known for bigger, bolder red wines and big, intense food, the vermouths were bigger and sweeter and more bitter and more citric and all of that stuff. So that's where you start getting this bifurcation or this diversity of styles. Now, over time, the desire to just ingest wormwood became subsumed in the use of vermouth in cocktails. And that is, of course, how and why most people buy vermouth today, is to use it in cocktails, to make cocktails of their own, but also to make drinks that reflect the canon of how people drank back in the late 19th century. Some of that, as Brett just said, vermouth and soda, the spritz, if you will. The spritz comes from a time long before anybody made red bitter, that fizzy drinks were the drinks of leisure. People loved the idea that they could add fizz to a drink. And so vermouth was one of the many things people made into spritzes. But then, of course, the martini and the Manhattan, the fashion for stronger drinks, very much an American fashion, I wonder why, became the next part of that. Now, there's a question here, which I want to go ahead and address right now.
Okay.
Can a vermouth be based in mistel? And the answer is yes. Aromatized wines are regulated as wine, but they have to be composed of at least 75% wine or grape must. Basically, European law does not differentiate between fully fermented wine, partially fermented fortified wine, and unfermented mistel or juice hit with alcohol right away. And the reason is there's just no compelling reason to do it, and it'd be really hard to regulate it even if you tried, because technically all mistel has fermented just at least a tiny bit, because as soon as you crush a grape, something's going to ferment. So who made vermouth? Wineries made vermouth. Certainly you see a lot of wineries today making vermouth. Distillers made vermouth because you could get a product out faster and less expensive. and get a lot of your flavor from the base wine or from and texture from the wine. But very few of those old regional producers remain. As you might imagine, between American Prohibition and the rise of vodka, traditional vermouth really took a hit from 1919 till about 10, 15 years ago. So a lot of smaller producers, and we'll talk about one here in a minute, went away. So it's nice to be able to represent two of the few remaining regional producers that were going back in the heyday of vermouth. But Dolan was an herbalist. They were always involved in the herbs and very much in their Dolan, sorry, in the sense of Chambéry vermouth is much more about the herbs than about the wine, whereas Koki they were always very much like other Piemontese producers at the time. When they made an aromatized wine, all the wines they had to work with were big and flavorful, and so they were an important part of the production. And that's maybe that and sweetness are the two core differences between Chambéry Vermouth and Torino Vermouth. Chambéry Vermouth, the wine's not that important. It's more for just texture and acidity, and the sugar is not as much for the sweeter kinds.
And now in Vermouth, that's a big wine you got on the Italian side there.
That's a big Barolo Canato.
Now, generally speaking, the Turin Vermouths are going to have a little more of like the baking spice character and a little less of the floral herb character, right?
Correct. And look, Italians like sweet things, and Italians like baking spices. These things were made to sell. That the idea that there are a few vermouths out there that are lovingly made from herbs plucked from just around the winery, and I can recommend a few for you. But in terms of the classical drive of this business, they were made to sell and made to get a name out more broadly through a branded product back when wine wasn't really branded.
There's a vermouth now in the United States that's made from just the gardens of a very large castle in Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Koki has made a little bit of stuff from some botanicals taken from a castle in Torino, but it's not cheap and it's very minty. All right, how do we use this stuff? So most folks think of the world of vermouth as dry vermouth and sweet vermouth, and that's fair. That's how most cocktail books and recipe books talk about it. There's a third category, which we'll talk about in a moment, but dry, the Chambéry style of dry vermouth, as I lose my poster, the Chambéry style of dry vermouth is the lightest style. There's no oxidation like you might see in the Marseille style. And while it has some sugar, it's not very much because the bitterness is very delicate and floral and herbal rather than spicy. It doesn't have to be all that sweet. A bone dry vermouth can work if the base wine is really drives the palate through, but a little bit of sugar helps keep Mary Poppins happy. But Chambéry dry vermouth are quite a bit drier than dry vermouths from Italy.
Jake, how much of this is the chicken and how much of this is the egg? Since Muscat was so important in some areas and on the French
mainly
side.
on the Torino side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, was that the driver in styles, or did the styles drive the use of the grapes?
I think having the grapes drove the use of the grapes, but you still are adding more sugar. The Torinese have a notorious sweet tooth, and might have a drier palate than everyone else in Italy, other than our German Italian friends. So the fashion was definitely quite sweet. Now, when we think about sweet vermouth in a normal book, we're thinking about what we think of as sweet red vermouth. And sweet red vermouth is not generally made with red wine. The tannins in red wine don't really work well with wormwood. The color comes from caramelized sugar, or occasionally from artificial colors, but caramelized sugar, which adds flavor and color and a bit of bitterness and a fair amount of texture, at least in the style of some producers. There is red vermouth made on the French side, on the Chambéry side. It's, again, still floral and herbal, still a Chambéry vermouth, and quite a bit less sweet. Now, the style that was invented in Chambéry, but then copied in Torino and made sweeter, is the style known as Blanc vermouth. Now, while we think of dry vermouth for martinis and sweet vermouth or red vermouth from Manhattans, the Blanc vermouth is the one you get to do with anything. And there's so many different things you can do with Blanc vermouth. We'll talk about a very small number of them today. Vermouth amaro is a derivative style a producer would make either back in the day or today to denote something that was still bringing that wormwood that everybody wanted, but also had other bitter botanicals in them. And usually more flavor intensity, more sweetness, something to go with bigger spirits. And the last thing here, this is a personal campaign of mine. Aromatized wines are bittersweet, and bittersweet things work with all kinds of foods. Now, those foods are exactly the kind of things you'd expect to eat at aperitif time. Cheeses, little salty, potato chips, olives, salami, pâtés and terrines, all those kind of things. To put very simply, since, there isn't a ton of time. Salt, when you have something salty and something bitter at the same time, you don't perceive the bitterness as much. Think about salting a pot of greens if you're simmering some greens or a vegetable soup. At the same time, though, bitterness scrubs fats and proteins and strong flavors off the palate in a way that normal wine can't. Now, some of that is the acid of the wine, but a lot of that is the bitterness, the wormwood, stimulating more salivation and really allowing your palate to clean up. At the same time, though, that bitterness also, digests. It helps with your digestion. It keeps you hungry for dinner. And that there's a real key point there is to say that from a physiological perspective, an aperitif and a digestif are the same thing.
Yes.
And so,
I would say, like, for me, like, the cocktails, many of the cocktails I love require vermouth, and I love that. But I would say I consume 75% of the vermouth I consume neat and, either before or after dinner, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a middle ground there. And we'll talk about this, especially in the world of Blanc vermouth. Just use a little bit of a spirit in a cocktail, what might be called a reverse drink. That's a lot of fun in that you get the nose from the spirit, but you don't get a ton of booze. And a lot of times, especially with really fragrant, clear spirits like tequila, like good Blanco tequila, all you really want to get from that in the finished cocktail is the nose, and you only need a little bit. So
it does correspond really well to kind of the latest like wellness movement that we're seeing in terms of higher quality, kind of great flavor, but maybe not kind of as boozy. And I think vermouth is a product that people will continue to discover and drink more of because of that.
Yeah, vermouth and other aromatized wines. The advantage vermouth has is that it shows up in a lot of cocktail books, and so it's the kind of the first.
It was certain for us in this exact day and age. I think that had to be the introduction for a lot of people, was the development of cocktail culture. But you're 100% now. I would agree that the volume of vermouth, the volume of good sort of artisanally produced vermouth that's selling right now, it has to be getting consumed on its own, just based on what is going through, what is going into consumers' homes.
I think, once you have it home and and especially if you know enough to know that you've got to get through a bottle once you open it, then you're going to explore in a lot of different ways. And that's the fun part. And there's a real continuum there. You don't have to, your Manhattans don't have to be 2 parts whiskey to 1 part vermouth. Julia Child would drink reverse martinis while she was cooking, and that reverse martini to her was dry vermouth on the rocks with a little dribble of gin. So 1 to 6, 1 to 8, something like that. I like those. I mean, who's to argue with Julia Child?
Yeah, good point.
All right. I hope at least some of you have some vermouth to taste. I'm going to run through 6 vermouths that we represent and talk about similarities and differences and whatnot. We got handy dandy little pictures there as well. And yeah, so we're going to start with Chambéry vermouth. If you were tasting these in order, this is the order I'd want you to taste them in. And the Chambéry vermouths are drier and lighter, so easier to taste at the beginning. Dolan Dry, very much a benchmark now, fresh, herbal, and floral, as is the Chambéry style. When the base wine at Dolan is made from a grape called Ugni Blanc. It's while it can make very fine wine, as folks like Dan will tell you, a lot of it is made for wine to be distilled. Now, the base wine here is not purely distiller's wine from very underripe grapes. But Dan, do you want to talk a little bit more about Ugni Blanc, especially Ugni Blanc from the southwest of France?
I mean, Ugni Blanc from the southwest of France, Flac de Gascon is also made from it. So there's some very classic, as well as, going into some of the drier white wines of Gascony and even the Cognac region. It's really a pretty grape, frankly. It goes by, and actually, I think the strength of it is that it's not neutral. Normally it's described as being neutral. I would say it has character, but it's not in your face, and so it makes a really beautiful palate. The beauty of distilling it is that you concentrate the aromas and the character of the fruits that's there, and you really get to see it expressed in a more concentrated form. But as a base, it's really a fantastic grape to use as a base starting point for any kind of project like this. I'm actually, the opposite is more surprising to me, that you can make wonderful, well-balanced vermouths from such an aromatic grape as Muscat and not have it overpower. But for a dry white vermouth, I think it's a great choice.
Yeah, Alicia, what is in terms of Ugni Blanc that we're selling is still wine? Where is most of that coming from? What are we pushing through?
Yeah, I mean, still, as Dan mentioned, in the Gascony region of Southwest France for sure. And then, as one of our viewers pointed out, it is Trebbiano. It was brought over from Italy, I want to say in like the 15th century or so, to France. Our Trebbianos, though, though the same grape variety, it's sometimes in Italy made with a little bit of a little less love, perhaps. It is one of the most planted varieties in the country, but I would use the word neutral for it there for the most part. There are some great examples, but I did just do a quick look on our website, and the most expensive Trebbiano we sell is $18.99, if that gives you any indication of the quality here.
Table wine, what we would call there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of very famous producers. Valentini is one. There are a couple others that make very, very expensive Trebbiano,
and they have to use that in Greece as well, right? Do they use, is that grown in Greece? Does it go that direction as well, or it only moved west from Italy?
Unless it's under some other name, I don't know.
Yeah,
very strongly.
Yeah, I don't know of it in Greece, but.
Yeah. So what I like to say about Dolan Dry in the world of the martini is that it adds texture where you need texture in your gin, and it adds structure when you need structure in your gin, and that's where it works so well as such a chameleon. And I think that a lot of that is driven from the really great acidity for vermouth that the Ugni Blanc provides, that real clean acidity. In terms of food pairings, I would say you could pair Dolan Dry with virtually anything you might pair a Sauvignon Blanc with if it's a little bit saltier. So maybe a goat cheese that's a little bit drier, maybe some tinned seafood, or some seafood that's a little bit more strongly flavored, or smoked fish. And then
spot prawns.
I'm sorry?
Spot prawns.
Spot prawns. Yeah, all those great Chicago spot prawns. And then at the risk of invoking St. Julia Child again, she always talked about cooking with dry vermouth instead of dry white wine because of the extra intensity, both alcoholic and flavor-wise, and that the herbs were more stable under heating than the aromatic elements of a regular dry white wine. So that's always a fun thing to do as well.
Hey, can I ask about Dolan? That's really become kind of a staple in bars across the country, kind of when that came to be, in terms of one of the go-to producers.
So they were founded in 1821, and they had a heyday, a couple of little heydays in America. One before Prohibition, where it became the established choice for a martini, and then a little bit in the 1960s, which that's when these come from. I sadly, it is not $1.98 now at Binny's, but it's something.
Yeah, it's a shame.
We started working with it in 2008, and we're
going to get a price match question on that. You realize that, right?
Oh God, sorry. And that was a time when cocktail consciousness was really just. Modern cocktail consciousness was just beginning to materialize, and the price was right, as we'd like to think it is still now, for both bars and shops to take it on. And I think that vermouths like this at these kind of prices are really important for shops as well, and we're very fortunate that Binny's is one of the very first big supporters. So thank you. All right, now we're going to move into the world of Blanc vermouth, and Blanc vermouth to me is the real entry drug for all of this. people feel like they have to have a dry vermouth and a red sweet vermouth, but Blanc vermouth is the one that gets to capture the imagination. Pale and sweet, invented in Chambéry by Dolan and then perfected in many folks' eyes by Camões, or at least introduced to the world, and then copied in Italy for what is the most widely sold vermouth in the world, which is Martini Bianco, it is a pale sweet vermouth, but like other Italian things, it's very much sweeter than Chambéry style vermouth. Now Camões, I went with the Camões next rather than Dolan Blanc because Camões is a little bit drier. So again, in a tasting progression, Dolan invented vermouth blanc. Camões took it to the world. The Camõeses worked for Dolan. They spun themselves off in 1856 and they introduced this vermouth blanc in 1881. And unlike Dolan, they really took it on themselves to introduce Chambéry to the whole world. Dolan was sold in America, was sold in the UK, and where Camões really became such an important part of the fabric of modern drinking was in Cuba, where this was for an entire generation the only vermouth sold in Cuba. And it became the cornerstone of some of the really famous Cuban cocktails, whether those are the classic sort of throne martinis or the drink pictured here, which is the El Presidente. The El Presidente, a wonderful drink of white rum, Blanc vermouth, a little bit of orange liqueur, and a little bit of grenadine for color. And it makes sense that Camões would be used for a drink like that. This is a drink with multiple sweeteners, and Camões is on the dry side for a sweet vermouth. What it also is it's a little more pertinent in terms of flavor profile than you might see in a lot of other Blanc vermouths, in terms that it's lower in vanilla, a little more wormwood, a real strong kind of stone fruit character that comes at least in part from cherry bark. But that lower vanilla means that if you want to mix this in a whiskey cocktail, it's going to work great as well. It's relatively new to the U.S. market. It's now owned and made by and made at Dolan. So they wanted to resurrect this recipe and this product so as to not lose this really key part of the modern history of Blanc vermouth. And I really recommend it. In terms of food, I always like to think of Blanc vermouth as if you're having a cheese plate of kind of widely disparate cheeses, Blanc vermouth is often going to be the one that's going to cut through the most of them. Now, Dolan Blanc, been around for quite a bit longer. You'll see the drink there with strawberries and a splash of soda. That's how we taught an awful lot of people to drink Blanc vermouth over the years. It does have a little bit of vanilla in it, which picks up those strawberries really, really well. Again, we could import 1,000 aromatized wines, and I still think that Dolan Blanc in particular, but Blanc vermouth in general, would be the entry drug, if you will. In terms of mixing, where both Blanc vermouths, but I think in particular particular Blanc really shines is with clear spirits that have a lot of fragrance, a lot of nose. And so here I'm thinking mainly about agave spirits, where so much of agave spirit, of a good agave spirit, is about the nose. But you could also talk about clear fruit brandies, or pisco, or things like that. The real key there is so you see the drink on the screen, which is just, like I said, Blanc vermouth, strawberries, and a splash of soda. You could add a little tiny bit of a really good agave spirit. You don't have to buy an inexpensive cocktail tequila to do this. Just a little bit of a really nice agave spirit that you're keeping around for sipping. You're going to get all those flavors coming through, but you're still going to get that real refreshing character that you want out of a drink like this. And much the same as with Camões, this is a great one when you're having a lot of different cheeses.
I like this one a lot, substituted into almost any whiskey drink that calls for regular sweet red vermouth. I think this just kind of changes it up a bit. And I always keep a bottle at home to use for those. I
actually prefer Camões in a lot of those drinks, simply because Dolan Blanc has a little more vanilla. Mm-hmm. And you want the whiskey character, the vanillins from the whiskey to express instead of trying to fight them. That's something we talk about a lot in general when it comes to mixing vermouth cocktails or cocktails with vermouth and spirits, is if your spirit has a lot of vanilla, you don't want your vermouth to have a lot of vanilla as well. Mm-hmm. So, segue.
Unless you like vanilla.
But I mean, look, you can take your vanilla whiskey and your vanilla vermouth, mix it together in a pot, heat it up on the stove very gently, burn off the alcohol, and use it to flavor an ice cream base, and you got really awesome Manhattan ice cream.
That's actually not.
I may have done that before.
I'm gonna think about that.
But you got to burn the alcohol off, or else you won't be able to get enough of the flavor into the ice cream base. All right, so finishing up on Dolan the Rouge, a personal favorite of mine because it is so light and elegant. Again, it's a Chambéry vermouth. It might be a red vermouth, so it does have that little bit of a caramelized character to it, but it's still herbal. It's still not going to be a big baking spice guy. And I want to start here, but into this idea for mixing, that there's more than you yourself can have more than one recipe for the same drink, depending on when you're going to drink it. So start here with the Negroni. The Negroni, pretty codified drink: gin, red bitter, red vermouth. If you're drinking that as an aperitif, kind of the classical sense of that, you want to drink that quickly. You want your Negroni to be delicate in body, have good acidity, not be too sweet, and have plenty kind of different kinds of bitternesses, and from herbal to the gentian and citrus of the red bitter, to get you ready for dinner. And Dolan Rouge is a great vermouth for the Negroni as the aperitif. If you're having a Negroni in the middle of the afternoon or maybe after dinner, then you might want a bigger, sweeter Negroni, and that's where a Torino vermouth is going to work better for you. Same thing goes for the Manhattan. If you want to have a Manhattan before dinner, pick a lighter whiskey, pick a lighter vermouth, maybe even go 50-50. I will admit I make very, very delicate Manhattans at home. I use low proof rye and Dolan Rouge 50-50 because it just feels more like a before dinner thing for me, and I don't drink a lot of cocktails after dinner. So while Dolan Rouge is not the biggest or sweetest here, it's definitely one that works well across the spectrum, and it works well at cocktail time, if you will, because of its delicacy. In terms of food, I would say, because this is less sweet and less bitter, you want to pair it with snacks that are a little bit less salty. So some nice olives or a nice pate or terrine works perfectly. Now we will traverse and head over to Torino, and we're going to talk about the world of Cocchi, Giulio Cocchi. So Dolan founded in 1821 in Chambéry. Cocchi was founded in 1891 in Asti. They're now headquartered in Coconato, which is a village within the commune of Asti. And they were founded to do both aromatized wines, such as vermouth, and sparkling wines. Now those two, so they wanted to dovetail those things. And so they wanted to use the grapes that they used in their sparkling wines in their aromatized wines so that they could kind of cross-sell. Well, that was all fine and dandy because back in the day, the real tradition for a base grape for a Torino vermouth was Moscato. And Moscato is, of course, a very important part of the sparkling wine world as well. And Cocchi is still one of the very few Italian producers that still uses all Moscato as the wine base. And Moscato brings a ton of flavor to the party. You're building your vermouth around the wine now. It brings orange flavors, other citrus flavors. It brings a lot of nose, a lot of floral character on the nose. They use Moscato fermented dry here, so you do get some pretty good acidity as well. But then, as a Torino producer, Cocchi had to deal with what the local taste was. And the local taste was bigger, sweeter, spicier. So kind of more of everything. More flavor from the wine, more sugar, more spice, more bitter, more citrus, more of everything.
So just in the middle, because Jake, you said that it was fermented dry. And so there's a big difference in when you harvest Moscato, am I right? That there you, just like a lot of grapes that will build a lot of sugar depending upon harvest time, determines how much residual sugar is allowed to build up in the grape. And is there a specific time, or is there a specific sugar they're trying to let the Moscato grow to before they harvest, even if they are still fermenting to dry?
Yeah, they're gonna pick it as if they were gonna make sparkling wine with it.
Okay.
So you're not overripe, not as underripe as distilling wine, but so still pretty good acidity. But it's just easier to hold, again, the practicalities of the vermouth world that you maybe that are still artisan, but maybe not the same as in the artisan wine world, it's still easier to ferment it dry. That way you have complete control over your sugar at the end.
Do they still make sparkling wine there, or
They
are they
do.
just purely Vermouth? Okay.
No, they do make sparkling wine. They make
Wow.
they make Alta Longa, which is Piedmont's answer to Champagne, made from Chardonnay and Pinot Nero. They make a bit of Asti Spumante from Moscato. They make a bulk fermented sparkling wine from Pinot Nero and Chardonnay. And my personal favorite of what they make is their Bracchetto d'Acqui. And those Bracchetto grapes are also used in Cochi's Americano Rosa. So again, another crossover. The Cochi are one of the few producers who still makes Americano, or wine bittered with gentian, which hopefully we'll talk about another night.
Mhm.
And that's again another real dovetail with the sparkling wine world for that.
We got a question I can take from Brian Wagner here. Asks, would we please be able to provide a style or profile comparison between Cochi and its competitor Antica Carpano? Brian, I would say, first of all, that Carpano Antica is technically a vermouth alla vanilla. So it is classic Torino style vermouth, but it does have added vanilla to it. In my opinion, it's a bit flabbier than the Cochi. If you're looking, like Jake mentioned earlier, if you're kind of looking to double down on some kind of vanilla heavy character, like it's very popular for Manhattans because of that. I personally, if you're going to get a Carpano, we now carry a Carpano Classico, which is essentially the Antica, but without the vanilla added. In my opinion, it's a better vermouth. But you should certainly try all three and compare them side by side. Overall, a little bit sweeter, and I think kind of a less intense layering of baking spice in the Antica versus the Cochi, personally.
I will say this about Carpano Antica. If you've never had it with chocolate mousse, you are missing one of the great food and wine pairings of the world. It is so good with chocolate mousse.
Really?
Yeah. So in terms of cocktails for Cochi Vermouth di Torino, now we're talking about a Manhattan with a bigger whiskey, maybe 100 proof whiskey, or a bigger rye. I love this in Rob Roy's because the acidity to me really stimulates the Scotch. And I think one of the fun things about making cocktails at home is you can make a Rob Roy with a nice malt Scotch, and that acidity adding and the dilution of the whiskey is really going to bring out a lot of interesting nuance. I'm a big Rob Roy fan, and I like making them with very nice whiskeys, and it's a lot easier and more cost effective to do that at home. And this is kind of the counterpoint to Dolan Rouge in terms of the Negroni. If you're having a Negroni as a drink by itself in the afternoon or after dinner, you might want that bigger, richer style here. One of my favorite food pairings with Cochi Vermouth di Torino is salami. And this is really that same interplay we talked about before, salt and bitter with fat and protein. That relationship, you might say, is quantitative. The more salty and higher fat and protein the snack, the more bitter a vermouth and more bitter and more sweet vermouth you're going to want to have. So, but Cochi's great old company. Again, one of the very few still making with all Moscato, and they've done it that way since 1891.
So we've talked a couple about Negronis. What is there something you recommend with a breakfast Negroni?
The breakfast Negroni. I
would go back to one of the Blancs.
I haven't had the few breakfast gin, so I don't.
Oh yeah, a few breakfast gin is nice.
That's actually not a bad idea.
Might get overpowered a bit on Negroni though.
Here, this is a good exercise for us. What would you, to make a breakfast Negroni, what would you pair with a few breakfast gin having had it? Right? Because that's sort of I'm
inclined to go toward a white Negroni if I was going to have one with breakfast, but then you're using, what you could do? You could use the few breakfast gin and then Luxardo Bitter Bianco, because it's a little more on the mild side, I'd say, and it wouldn't dominate the gin. Right. I'd maybe try that. And then
the Luxardo Bitter Bianco is it's mild bitterness. It's quite sweet. That's you just have to be careful in terms of sweetness.
You might not want to stick to the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio.
Right. What is the profile of the Few Breakfast Gin? I will admit, all I know about it is that it's called Few Breakfast Gin.
Earl Grey tea.
Earl Grey tea.
Bergamot.
So interesting. A little anecdote from back in the day. Immediately after we started selling Dolan Rouge in New York, the good folks at Death and Company, quite a famous cocktail bar, would always keep Earl Grey infused Dolan Rouge around. So I think there's an argument for Dolan Rouge. In terms of the bitter, I do sell a red bitter that you guys like quite a lot, and I think a breakfast Negroni should probably be a little bit lower in sugar. But I don't know if you want to talk about that or not.
Sure. Cappelletti Aperitivo, in my opinion, the best red bitter we sell.
Well, there you go.
It is wine based though, so you treat it like a vermouth. You have to keep it refrigerated. It's not like a Campari where you can just keep it behind the bar.
Yeah.
But it's reasonably priced, and it's, in my opinion, hands down the best red bitter that we carry.
Yeah. The secret, there's a thing I keep coming back to and talk about aromatized wines, and that's acidity. And acidity in a cocktail works the same way as acidity in wine. It literally keeps you awake. It keeps your palate awake. It keeps your brain awake. And Aperitivo Cappelletti, being wine-based, has a really nice acidity. And that's something that can cut through. If you think about what a Negroni is, it's 2/3 sweet stuff. So that acidity is really, really helpful. Now, the last vermouth in our lineup is a Vermouth Amaro. Marty, the red bitter was Aperitivo Cappelletti. Pat can put it in the chat, or someone with a CAPPELLETTI. Nicely inexpensive too.
Reasonably.
And then we're gonna have a botanical follow up with probably Dan on bergamot here in a second, but keep on going to Dopo Teatro.
So Dopo Teatro, after the theater, or it's the Torino slang for late night happy hour. And the idea is to have a little something sweet on the way home, usually with a little something else that's sweet. These folks, the Torinese, man, every time we go out with the Koki folks, there's like 10 desserts. It is this Torinese thing that you can't get away from. So this isn't meant to be more bitter as much as it's meant to have a more broad expression of bitter botanicals. The other two main bitter botanicals in this are rhubarb root, which is smoky. If you've ever had our Amaro Sfumato, that's almost pure rhubarb root, nicely smoky. And then quinine is the other main one here, quinine from cinchona bark, and hopefully at a later date we'll talk about quinquina. What's cool about quinine when you match it with wormwood in the same aromatized wine is they stimulate completely different parts of the tongue. And so what you end up with overall when you sip it is something that feels very balanced. No part of your tongue is being challenged, even though there's a lot of different botanical flavors going on. The base here is both Moscato and Nebbiolo. So Nebbiolo, of course, the king grape of Piemonte. It brings a little more gutsiness to the party, a redder color, as well as some really interesting nose elements. For me, if you're gonna mix cocktails with this, big whiskeys. This is where you get that Binny's single cask, whether it's an American straight whiskey or a Scotch, and this is going to work really well. I will admit I have shaken this with mezcal and lime juice, and that's rather impressive as well.
Wow.
I came up with that drink. It's on our website. I sent Pat a list of cocktails links to our website.
And those links, we'll get those links up on this. Will live this whole chat will live on the website, and those links will be attached to the website as well.
Oh, fantastic!
Producer Jim gets those up.
Thank you, Jim. But the other fun here is, the extra bitterness and the extra bitterness kind of scrubbing all parts of the palate make this really fun to pair with a chocolate dessert. Maybe not a square of super dark bitter chocolate. That's where Barolo Chinato, the really classic digestif, comes in. But a nice, rich chocolate dessert is going to work great with Dopo Teatro. I'm definitely of the camp that says you can't really pair wine with chocolate because the botanicals do so much work to scrub the palate clean, do such a better job, in my view, to scrub the palate clean. So what we've had here is two very different styles of vermouth, both very classical, both dating from before really the heyday of the cocktail, or right at the heyday of the cocktail. These things exist not because of cocktails, but cocktails exist because of these two styles of vermouth. And that's a really important way to build up your understanding and your kind of feeling and intuition about why the classic cocktails are classics and why they exist.
And
Now,
certainly
Jake,
certainly I think the most pointed of that is the martini, which is something we can talk about as we go along. I mean, the martini was created because vermouth was used to cover up bad gin, at least part of the reputation of the martini. If you follow the idea that the martini was actually the Martinez and it started in San Francisco in the late 1840s, early 1850s. I mean, for that, the vermouth absolutely was the beginning of was introduced purely to cover up bad gin. And so that could have a lot of insight into North American based cocktails.
Right. There was very little dry vermouth in the 1840s, though. Because the quality of the fortifying spirit wasn't high enough. You had to cover the fortifying spirit with sugar for the same reason the gin was a little bit dicey. But as fortifying spirit got higher purity and less expensive, you could use a little bit less sugar. And that's where the Chambéry style, where you're not overloading with citrus and heavily bitter things, really came to the fore.
Yeah, where do we get? We want to have a deviation because I know that we're not supposed to say the M word or make health claims around alcohol. Our outgoing president has granted me immunity from prosecution, so I am going to talk about it as medicine. Dan, if you had, we had a comment by Vermin, and I'm interested to see what you think. Just the comment was, not unlike Wormwood's reputation, you can actually overdose on bergamot. And it was it's a little bit of a side, but what do you know about this?
You can actually overdose. You can get some paralysis, but I think, it was sort of.
Is this like the poppy seed bagel thing?
I think it was something like 7 liters of Earl Grey. With the right Earl Grey, if you drink 7 liters of Earl Grey a day, you can actually begin to get sensation. So they're actually. I mean, but bergamot used in sort of a standard way, you're not going to overdose on. I love bergamot oil. I mean, we have bergamot tree, and I actually make bergamot ice cream. So it's actually, all of those sort of sour citruses are just so beautifully aromatic, and vermouths express them so well. I really.
When we get to Quinquina, we'll get to talk about my favorite funny citrus, which is Cedrat.
That is a cool citrus.
Which is a really, really cool citrus and incredibly fragrant.
A couple vermouths I suppose we didn't get to today. I'm kind of going over. I have this outline that I would normally do an employee class through here. You might run into a vermouth called Vermouth Con Bitter, which is really just Punta Mez now, right, Jake?
I mean, Vermouth Con Bitter and Vermouth Amaro are certainly related, and it's Punta Mez has been labeled as Vermouth Amaro in the past.
Yeah, it's just vermouth with added bitters to it, essentially.
Yeah, vermouth with additional bitterness. I mean, the Punta Mez is a little bit of a tricky situation in the domestic market in Italy. It's got to be bottled at relatively low alcohol for tax reasons, and so the profile is a little. A lot of the bitterness I find when I have it over there comes from caramel as much as it does from gentian. But certainly gentian is the classic bitter, the classic half point, if you will, for Punta Mez.
Yeah, point and a half.
So Dopo Teatro is a very different take on the world of Vermouth Amaro, trying to build up kind of more perfume and a more kind of balanced stimulation across the palate.
I think it leans more toward I think a lot of times when you hear something like a Vermouth Amaro, you're thinking more of like a Vino Amaro, where it's more bitter and more intense, whereas this is more like a Vermouth Chinato, where it's just got kind of added levels of that woodsy bitterness, maybe.
But that's two sides of the same coin. I mean,
Okay.
how bitter it shows is going to be based, one, on the balance of the bitter expressions of the different botanicals across the palate, and two, on the amount of sugar.
So Dan, jump in.
No, I was just I was going to ask, was there a tradition of vermouth ever being oxidized? I mean, was the color always coming from caramel,
There's a
or
huge, well, in Italy,
in Italy? Yes.
not really. I mean, obviously, Noyer Prat, which is a very famous old large vermouth brand, originally from Marseille.
Mhm.
That is a deliberately oxidized style of vermouth that can be very, very delicious, particularly on its own. I like a clean vermouth in a martini, but I mean, the real Noyer Prat, especially the old Noyer Prat that we got for a couple of years here in America, it can be really, really fascinating. The current Noyer Prat, the so-called extra dry, I like it with tonic.
Oh, we've got a bottle of the old one here in the vermouth and ham fridge next to our office. I'll have to try it next time you're here. We got
At some
couple
point
questions.
in the future, at some point in time in a future episode, by the way, the cousin hams to the ham that's in the vermouth and ham fridge are now hanging also within 15 or 20 feet of Dan Farber. So just curing very close to the balsamic
The question
vinegar.
is that companion episode going to be the Rancio episode?
Well, there you go. Because we need to but for just for everybody listening, we'll sort of recap and we'll recap and talk about some of the things we want to cover up, because with the group of some things we want to cover, not cover up, despite my immunity, we want to cover. Amongst, just so folks know, and I would probably encourage our listeners just to think about this, because if you want to shoot some ideas to us at spirits@binnies.com, Pat and I will both at the very least see that email and we can add them into topics. But some of the things I know we wanted to cover, because Jake is generous to give us his time and expertise, as well as Dan and Alicia. We certainly have discussed the fact we want to take a deviation into some bitters and things that are driven by gentian and some of the other traditional roots. Wouldn't mind having a little bit of coverage of some of the history of drinks or things that were created that are somewhat like vermouth but aren't quite vermouth as part of the coverage. I know we were going to cover some more obscure fortified wines, like Carcavelos et al. Maybe talk about things, because we hear a lot about port and sherry. Maybe we don't hear about Carcavelos or Madeira or Marsala or some of the things.
And
like
they all have
that.
increasingly popular applications in cocktails as well.
So these are things that we're going to be covering in. We made the mistake of making our agave series a 4-part series that turned into 8, because once we started diving in, between our interest of both everybody that was talking about it and the interest of folks that joined us pretty dedicatedly over the course of the first 4 weeks, it turned into 8. And so we're not sure how long this is going to be, but those are some topics.
It'll be a good ride.
All right.
Exactly.
We had a couple more questions here.
I answered one.
Okay. And were you implying that it was better in the States here?
No, I just like them for different they serve different purposes,
Okay. Bob asked, where would Few Amaro fall profile wise? I don't know that I've ever had Few's Amaro, Brett.
It was created. It's been a while. I thought Few Amaro to me was sweet, and was also, the bitterness was a little bit lean. It was a project that they did, I believe they did for one of the early on in their existence. They did it for one of the bars. They might have done it for Scofflaw.
One point I did want to make today is we've brought up aperitif, digestif a couple times, and the reason these things work so well for that is there's human evolution, and that's because we are putting what has historically been a somewhat poisonous plants and herbs into these drinks, and your body's natural response is to stimulate digestion. Your body wants to get bitterness is a hallmark of many poisons in evolutionary history, right, Dan? And so the natural human response to bitterness is to stimulate digestion. You taste bitter, your body thinks, oh, this is poison, get it out of me as fast as possible. And that's why you salivate, and that's why it can be considered digestive and things like that. Some fun point to bring up.
Yeah.
Jake, before we leave Wormwood, can you discuss a little bit about the uses of Pontica versus Absinthium versus the sort of standard Wormwood, and the source, modern sources for those today?
At this point, a lot of the sourcing kind of overlaps. To me, Absinthium, because it's so potent, is still very cost effective for most of the modern uses. The one that the Artemisia that the French called Genepi has a very different character. It's a much more clean and green character, especially, and it keeps a greenness when you even after you distill it.
Yeah.
And it takes a reinfusion very well. And so distilling and reinfusing Genepi is very common in the French Alps, especially to make a liqueur, which we sell one. Dolan makes one. Dolan is more famous for Genepi in France than they are for Vermouth. And there's a real difference there. And you don't see a lot of Genepi used in pure infusion. It's a little bit rarer, and it's a lot of it goes into making a distillate. But once Americans lifted the ban on absinthe, a lot of the sort of fussing about Artemisias became a little bit easier to deal with.
A couple more questions. Marty Peterson asked, why don't we see more Blanc vermouths in stores?
I would tell you, as a retail buyer, that a lot of that, quite frankly, had to do with sales. There was a time, not in the very recent past, when based on velocity, you really only needed to have a couple of sweet vermouths. The perception of vermouth was that you had dry vermouth for martinis and you had sweet vermouth for Manhattan's old fashions, and there wasn't anything in between. And this Blanc showed up, and it was weird, and it didn't seem to fit, at least in that present mind, which, Jake has obviously told us that that's not the case. But for a lot of people, it didn't fit in either a martini or a Manhattan / old fashioned. Negronis weren't popular yet, so what do you use it for? Now that vermouth is starting to come into its own a little bit, not only as a modifier for cocktails, but in a lot of cases as either drunk consumed on its own or as a lead in cocktails, does all of a sudden Bianco vermouth become much, much more relevant.
Well, I think there's a profile issue too. I mean, the original pale sweet vermouths that you saw on regular American shelves were Italian. Martini Bianco is if you look at the traditional botanical build for a Blanc vermouth, which Martini essentially uses. They were trying to copy Dolan Blanc, but with more vanilla and then more sweet. That botanical build for a cocktail or for a modern use maybe couldn't deal with the sweetness that Italians really want. And so I think there was kind of a mismatch, speaking technically, a mismatch between flavor profile and sweetness. And that's why I think people really dug Dolan Blanc when it first came in. America, we think Americans have this huge sweet tooth, but let me introduce you to my Italian friends.
Another question, Lynn asked, what's a good entry level, quote unquote, vermouth for beginners? I've only seen Martini and Rossi in my small town. Is that okay, or can I do better? Chances are you can find Dolan in your small town now as well.
We can help if you need help.
Yeah. Dolan is not much more in terms of price point wise. Dolan isn't. Martini and Rossi is a bit less expensive, but not much. Dolan is pretty reasonably priced.
Yeah.
In terms of, and you have the benefit of all of the Dolan examples come in 375. So if you don't want to commit to that first bottle just to make sure you're getting something you like, you can always buy a 375. Or if you're only going to use it sporadically. Yeah, exactly. So
of the truly cheap industrial vermouths that are widely available, my fellow panelists may make fun of me, but tasting them blind side by side many times, I think Gallo is better than Martini and Rossi personally, if those are your only two options. But again, Dolan is.
We're assuming there are no Bacardi people listening to this.
Hey, make better vermouth. You want me to speak better about your vermouth?
Well, and if you get it in Noilly, and Noilly is also relatively inexpensive. That might be worth a deviation if you're drinking M&R to grab Noilly Prat if that's available in your area.
I will say for bars that have to hit a really low price point for like a happy hour Manhattan or something, what I see the most for so-called nice bars that are doing that is Cinzano.
Yeah. Cinzano, another classic Italian vermouth.
Yeah.
Vermouth is a really good bang for the buck. I mean, quality-wise, across the board. I mean, we may sort of giggle about some of these things, but in blind tastings, Pat, like you're right. A lot of these very inexpensive products do quite well sitting next to some much, much more expensive products. And I think the quality across the board is really pretty high with vermouths.
Once you
Here's
up the
the question:
bitterness,
Does Gallo use wormwood? Do we know of, or
I think so,
does anybody know?
I think so.
Do they? Okay.
I think to Dan's point, it's a real, once you start to up bitterness and up complexity in a vermouth, it's a real high wire act to get the balance right. There's a lot of modern vermouths out there. Some of them are really delicious, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It became, we got all kinds of weird vermouths getting made everywhere now, and they're all interesting to taste, but do you end up finishing the bottle? Maybe not.
Right. And I was really thinking about European vermouth.
No.
Okay, but
But you're going up in complexity even from something like Gallo or Cinzano to Dolan.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
And it's that's not the easiest thing to do. There's a reason why the people that make the people who have stood the test of time have stood the test of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think understand too when you start to think, because now that we've brought up Gallo, and which sort of leads to the idea of domestically or U.S. produced vermouths. I think my experience or my observation is that a lot of them are almost there are things that are referred to as vermouth that are done less to be traditionally like a vermouth and more like a riff on a sort of a bitter or another sort of botanical liqueur that they just happen to be calling vermouth.
Right. Which
you had a number of wineries, and it doesn't make them bad products.
We would prefer people to respect traditional categories.
Yeah.
Well, but
there's an American product called Americano that isn't wine.
Right.
It's not strict. It's not limited to vermouth.
Sure. So
have
everybody.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Have these terms been put up kind of into trade negotiations, similar to how some companies in the U.S. are exempt from the kind of use
champagne.
of champagne and so forth?
Yeah, there's just not enough juice in it for anyone to really care that much, unfortunately. But no, these are in European law. In fact, vermouth has protected geographic indications, and Chardonnay and Torino are two of them.
Right. What's the hesitation in the U.S. to use wormwood? I mean, I know that's not the only kind of feature that they're not respecting, but is it just it's not growing everywhere, or they don't like its influence?
They don't like it, I think.
Okay.
They want to trade on the category vermouth because people see vermouth in cocktail books or in recipes, but they don't like the taste of it, or they just want to be different. Well, it's like, yes, you're not vermouth.
Yeah.
And you hit it, Jake. And I think, and I think, Jake, I think you hit it on the head. It is a combination of wanting to do something different and not necessarily we're gonna blow this up, boom, right? And then so they label something vermouth when in reality they're just trying to make a sort of wine-based botanical cocktail of some sort.
And there's a natural tension there, right? Which goes back to a lot of it goes back to cocktails. It's like if things that are a little more toward the style of the things we're talking about tonight are going to work better in more different cocktails. This is the same thing in the world of gin, right? A big, rich, junipery gin with a lot of that dark, oily character in the middle back of the palate, which is where what juniper tastes like when you distill it, is going to work better in traditional gin cocktails than something that's super herbal or floral. And those gins work in a lot of other cocktails. I mean, I sell quinquina. Those herbal and floral gins are my friends when I'm talking about quinquina. But it's the same thing. And so the part of the tension of the business is, do you play to stand out, or do you play to be versatile? And that's the case in so many things.
Right. Just one quick one is we'll get it real quick, boys. They're sweet, harder and harder to find. Marty, we carry it. I'm not sure why you're finding it hard to find, or maybe, it certainly doesn't sell as much as it did at one point in time, but I think that it's still producing. It's still an active, vital company. So it's out there.
Boissiere was a Chambéry producer, but the company that bought the brand now makes it in Italy.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. Well, guys, thanks for joining us. I appreciate the perspective.
Guys and girls.
We're going to have to talk more about some of these kind of vermouth cousins like Americano and Barolo Chinato and things like that.
Pat, why don't you lay down a marker where we start next week?
Oh, wow. First of all, are you guys available next week? But I think we got to talk about probably quinquina and kind of the history of cinchona as the terrible M word and how that works into
quinine is a great modern story.
Quinine too. Yeah.
I mean, cinchona, quinine. Quinine is a great modern story that, if you tell it, sounds exactly like the story of CBD today.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does.
And there are a few things, the bouncing in of quinine and bittering. There are a few other very prominent, European liqueurs, Dubonnet et al. That we can talk about.
And talking about quinine gives me a good excuse to, rail against colonization and exploitation and things like that. So it's generally a fun topic to discuss.
There's one on every panel.
Yep.
Thank you for being that.
All right. So,
Dan,
I guess.
Did you have a comment?
No, eventually I would. It's fun to explore like the range of botanicals, or the classic botanicals that really go into vermouth, because it's just such a beautiful cornucopia of herbs and spices, right? Some are post Marco Polo, some are actually even pre Marco Polo. It's a great topic. Besides just the wormwood.
Yes.
Well, we could talk about that, because eventually we want to come around. Maybe we cover quinquina, or cover that this week, but then we also do a Vermouth 201 where we dig, after we cover sort of a related category, then we come back and do a little bit deeper dive into those botanicals before we head off into fortified wines.
Dan,
Jake gets to break out his tongue mapping.
Who does?
I said Jake has a whole slide, has a whole presentation on which botanicals affect which parts of your tongue and how to build drinks on that. So he loves talking about that.
I think that's I think that's a fantastic idea, actually. I mean, if you really want to, it's how you have that happen, but then incorporate into not thinking about it too hard.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing about the discussion is side botanicals is, one, the producers aren't always going to tell you everything they use.
Oh yeah, everything's a big secret.
Two, if the aromatized wine that uses these interesting side botanicals is good, unless it's, and we'll set quinquina aside for a moment because for a reason I'll explain in a minute, they may not show through so overtly. Now in quinquina, because quinquina was a purely modern thing, a late 1800s modern aromatized wine style, often the side botanicals were the ways the producers created a distinction for themselves in what was a highly overheated market for this stuff in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that's a big part of the story of quinquina. And that's how we get to Cedrat, my favorite citrus.
Everyone's got to have a favorite citrus.
That's right.
So next week's tale of quinquina, Cedrat, and bergamot.
There we go.
All right, cool. Well, we'll follow up with more of a plan by next week. Everybody else, count on it next Monday then for continuing aromatized wine. And Brett and I will be back on Wednesday with New Riff Distilling, talking about a couple limited release whiskeys that are very limited, but worth talking about. So it'll be fun. So we got
And-
a slight bourbon break here.
Yep. And again, and remember, if you guys have any ideas or any other comments you want to make, just shoot them to spirits@binnies.com and we
Yeah,
can
if you
address
see,
those. And
if
then
there's
send them
a aromatized or fortified wine question you want to see us cover here or topic, by all means, let us know and we'll make sure we get to it. So, all right, Jake, thanks again. Dan, thank you as always. Alicia, thanks for jumping on.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody else, thanks for joining us tonight. Cheers, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.